In 1870, he enjoyed the luxury lifestyle of a North African prince. 7 years later, he was selling groceries on a remote island in the Pacific Ocean just to survive. Hi there, I'm Jake, I've got a master's degree in history, and this is the tragic tale of Boumezrag El Mokrani, the Algerian royal who became a shopkeeper halfway across the world. Our story starts with a fly swatter that single-handedly set off a chain of events that would lead to the conquest of an entire country. For centuries, the Days of Algiers served the Ottoman Empire as regional governors of Algiers, a port city that now serves as the capital of Algeria. It was there, in April 1827, inside the illustrious palace of the day, that the 27th of his name, Hussein Day, was preparing for a confrontation with the French ambassador to Algiers. The issue was one of outstanding debt. 3 decades previously, Algiers had provided French Emperor Napoleon with an enormous amount of grain for the Napoleonic Wars, and despite multiple requests, they still hadn't been paid back. Asking him why the King of France had not responded to his latest inquiries on the matter, the snooty French ambassador replied that His Most Christian Majesty simply could not lower himself to correspond with someone as unimportant as him. And so, in an uncharacteristic fit of fury, the usually composed Hussein Day grabbed a traditional peacock feather fly whisk, struck the diplomat 3 times on the arm, and then ordered him to leave. Enraged at the disrespect, France sent a squadron of battleships and demanded a formal apology. The proud Day refused, giving the French, who were looking to expand their colonial empire into the Mediterranean, the perfect pretext to launch a full-scale invasion of Algeria. Under the guise of liberating the Algerians from their weak overlords, the Ottoman Turks, the conquest commenced with the fall of Algiers. By the middle of the century, after suppressing a number of native revolts, the French were undisputed masters of Algeria, but their biggest challenge was yet to come. In 1838, as the French were busily stamping out the last embers of indigenous resistance, a young prince was born just outside of Algiers in Medjana, the traditional home of the highborn Mokrani clan. Boumezrag El Mokrani was one of the 5 sons of El Hajj Ahmed ben Mohammed, better known as Ahmed Bey. When the French invaded in 1830, Ahmed initially fought against them alongside his regional lord, the Bey of Constantine. But eventually, at around the same time as his son's birth, Boumezrag's father allied with the French when it became obvious that resisting them was impossible. In 1838, his new masters granted him the title of Caliphate, which reasserted his right to exercise ultimate authority over his domains. However, by 1845, the French had gone back on their word by decreeing that Ahmed Bey would now have to answer to a senior French military officer. Over the next 25 years, the authority and territories of the Mokrani and the other noble houses of Algeria were gradually stripped away. The last straw came in 1870, when the French introduced a civilian regime that extended their jurisdiction over vast stretches of the country. By this time, the humiliating decline of his once prestigious house had convinced Boumezrag's brother, Mohammed El Mokrani, who was now head of the family, that armed rebellion was the only solution. What followed was the largest ever insurrection against the French in Algeria. Starting in March 1871 at the Mokrani stronghold in Medjana, it quickly spread to nearly all parts of the country, with more than 250 tribes taking part. Boumezrag El Mokrani assumed leadership of the uprising when his brother was killed in May. However, bolstered by reinforcements from Paris, the French soon gained the upper hand, and he was driven back into the mountains of North Algeria. Eventually, Boumezrag was captured by the French in an oasis in the Sahara Desert after being found passed out from exhaustion by a pool of water. Initially given the death penalty by the French, this was commuted in favour of a much harsher punishment. For his role in orchestrating the uprising, Boumezrag El Mokrani was condemned to live the rest of his days far, far away from his beloved homeland, on a tiny spit of land in the Pacific Ocean called New Caledonia. In a desperate last attempt to stay, he begged French authorities to allow him to serve his sentence on Algerian soil, but his request was refused. On September 1st, 1874, along with many fellow revolters, he stepped on board the ship Le Calvados, leaving his wife, children and country behind to start another life in a distant and alien land. After a difficult 3-month voyage, the prisoners arrived in New Caledonia, which had served as a French prison colony since 1853. Since the Algerians were political prisoners and had been classed as simple deportees, they were not required to undergo manual labour like common criminals. Instead, they would spend the majority of their internment on the Isle of Pines, an isolated island off of the mainland, where they were expected to contribute to the colonisation of New Caledonia. There, they were put to work cultivating crops on small patches of land that would eventually become private property. At first, the homesick Algerians lived all together in a large common shed where they slept, ate and prayed. Then, to make ends meet, many of them started their own small businesses, including Boumezrag El Mokrani. The former prince and revolutionary leader reinvented himself as the owner of a thriving grocery store, and before long, shopkeeper Boumezrag had become a well-known and respected member of the local community. For a time, it seemed that his destiny was tied to this paradise island. Then, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to return to Algeria presented itself. In the year 1878, Boumezrag was passing through the new Caledonian capital of Noumea when he heard that the native Kanak tribe had risen up in revolt. For more than 5,000 years, after their earliest ancestors had sailed there from Southeast Asia, the indigenous Kanaks had called New Caledonia their home. In 1853, though, they had been forced to share it when it was annexed by the French. What followed was a systematic seizure of traditional lands that had reduced the once proud tribes of the island to small, isolated communities. It was an all too familiar story to the now middle-aged ex-prince, but Boumezrag El Mokrani was clearly unmoved by their struggle when he offered to help the governor suppress it. This was because, as a man who had once brushed shoulders with the French elite and considered them his equals even if they didn't, he also believed the Kanaks were a lesser race to be subjugated. However, it wasn't racial hatred that drove him to assist his oppressors. Rather, it was the prospect of going home that spurred him to act, for if he impressed the French with a show of loyalty, there was a chance his sentence could be reduced. It was with the same hope that 40 other Algerians also joined him to form a cavalry scout unit that performed with significant distinction over the 2-year uprising. Their exploits included handing over the dismembered head of a rebel chief to French authorities, and killing and wounding another chief, as well as 12 of his fellow tribesmen. After the revolt was put down, some Algerians got their wish. One by one, the leaders of the Arab band were slowly pardoned, but there was a notable exception. For Boumezrag El Mokrani, a ticket back to his homeland never materialised, because his famous name still carried weight back in Algeria, making him a threat to French rule there. In the end, his only reward would be a change of status from political prisoner to free settler. By 1882, it was clear he had given up all hope of ever returning to Medjana when he proclaimed in a letter that he would no longer try to petition authorities for his return. But he still clung on to one last hope. In that same letter, he asked if it was possible if his family could join him in exile. Unlike before, this time the French were more than happy to accommodate his request. This was because it was in their political interest to remove as many Mokranis as possible from North Africa to avoid a repeat of 1871. Free passage to New Caledonia, land concessions, financial assistance, and even the possibility of bringing household servants with them were all offered to his surviving family, who were scattered around Algeria and neighbouring Tunisia. But then, on September 16, 1882, his heart was broken when the Minister of Colonies received a formal refusal from his relatives. New Caledonia was simply too far away. Having accepted that he would never be allowed to leave or to see his family again, Boumezrag El Mokrani took advantage of his free settler status to move to the capital of New Caledonia, where, over the next few decades, he devoted his energy to the expansion of his business. By 1901, this enterprising ex-prince had built up a modest commercial empire across the island, which included 2 stores. In addition, having seen that the island's roads were often impassable when it rained, he used his extensive knowledge of horses to start a postal transport company. Yet, through all of this, he still dreamt of returning to his homeland, now nothing but a blurred and distant memory. That chance came in 1904. With the help of a French lawyer, his request for pardon was finally granted. On May 18, 1904, the elderly Mokrani stepped onto a boat that took him back to Algeria after 30 years of exile. Upon his arrival, he moved in with his son, who was the mufti of a mosque in Orleansville, known today as the city of Schlef. Against all the odds, he had somehow made it back, but it would be a bittersweet ending. In exchange for his pardon, he had agreed to never set foot in his home region of Constantine, and so it was that on July 10, 1905, Boumezrag El Mokrani died without ever having seen his precious Medjana again. If you'd like to see more historical stories you won't see anywhere else on YouTube, consider subscribing.